Hello and welcome to Human Ascension with Ellie. Today I'm going to be talking about something that is broken up into three different parts, and it may seem at first as though those three parts are not related. But when you really think about it, they're all examples of what humanity is currently going through, but manifesting in lots of different ways. And they provide a clue about the way that we are progressing along a path towards our new existence. And the things that we need to be mindful of, in particular, the number one thing that we need to be mindful of as we progress down the path. The very first thing that I'm going to be talking about today goes all the way back to around about 2009. In January of 2009, America had a new president, and that was Barack Obama. He entered office as the 44th president. He inherited, arguably, a disaster state. The country was in financial crisis. The crisis was in full bloom. The American people were suffering from a lack of jobs or business opportunities. There were really high interest rates. The cost of food was extortionate. The cost of everything was extortionate, and everything else that, comes with a recession, a great recession. It was a recession so great that really it had become probably close to a depression. And some people were beginning to talk about it as though it was a depression. The people were fed up, and the voters had booted out the old and were itching for the new. And so, of course, Barack Obama represented hope. That was one of his slogans, and so he was elected. President Obama's chief of staff at the time was a man called Rahm Emanuel, a man who had been a lifelong Democrat. Emanuel had been an advisor and a senior advisor to previous Democratic President Bill Clinton. He'd also been the chair of the Democratic caucus during the time that George W. Bush was president. And he had also spent time as the mayor of Chicago, from what I understand. Emanuel served as Obama's chief of staff for nearly 2 years, after which he was appointed to the role of ambassador to Japan, which was a role that he kept until just a few days before Donald Trump took office again in January of 2025. Interestingly, in terms of his political and diplomatic career, which has so far spanned more than 30 years, the thing that Rahm Emanuel is best known for in ordinary circles is something that he said, rather than anything that he has done, even though he's been responsible for a lot of policy reform. Emanuel is very famous for having popularized the phrase, and I quote, "Never let a crisis go to waste." It was a phrase that kind of encapsulated Emanuel's political philosophy. And that was that, you don't want to create the crisis, but if you are presented with a crisis, despite the painful experience of that crisis, and no matter how devastating it might be for individuals or the collective, the crisis also represents a unique moment in time. And that unique moment is ripe with opportunity, because a crisis is a time when people are desperate for change. And in order to escape the crisis, they will probably follow the lead of anyone who has the power to create an environment that could potentially change the world and help people to escape that crisis. So to illustrate my point, I want to have a look at some of the recent examples of how Rahm Emanuel and others with the same mindset inside the Obama administration turned a crisis into an opportunity, despite the odds being against them at the time. Because after all, Barack Obama, for most of his presidency, had a minority in the House of Representatives and also a minority in the Senate. So the likelihood of him getting any kind of legislation agreed and voted on positively by both houses was pretty slim. But what he did have going for him was a crisis that the entire country was desperate to escape from. So The first example is the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which is the ARRA, I think it's called. And the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009 involved the collapse of major financial institutions, including the stock exchange and all of the major banks, basically. It resulted in what was ultimately called that Great Recession, and it created an extraordinary sense of urgency. With widespread economic turmoil, traditional policy approaches were pretty much off the table. Something had to happen, something new had to happen. It had to happen really fast to be able to save the country. And one of the first things that happened very quickly. Within a month of taking office, the Obama administration managed to get the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act passed in Congress against the odds. The ARRA injected a stimulus package of around $800 billion into the US economy. It was designed to jumpstart the economy, create new jobs and stabilize financial markets. Some say that the reform was successful. Some say it wasn't successful and that it was a failure or that it prioritized the wrong places. But that's not the point. The point is that without there being a crisis at the time, it's unlikely that such a radical reform of the economic system could have even been agreed so quickly. And in a Congress that was divided as well, regardless of who was in office at the time. So that's one example. Another example is the Healthcare Reform Act. And almost immediately following that economic reform policy, another radical reform measure was somehow voted into legislation in record time, kind of. It was during the turbulence of that same recession, and the Obama administration was really hotly pursuing a major overhaul of the US healthcare system. By viewing the crisis as an opportunity, Obama's team was able to push through the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, which is commonly known as Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act. It was a very contentious negotiating process in Congress. But despite the fighting and the political drama, the actual crisis of the recession created an atmosphere that helped to shift public opinion in favor of reform. The financial crisis had hit the insurance industry really hard, and Obama's team, alongside the wider Democratic Party, were able to spend a lot of time on the airways, on the various different cable shows and in advertising, discussing how fragile private insurance industry is and how fragile the systems are, and selling to the public the idea of government healthcare initiatives that bring stability to millions of people during times of economic stress. So the Affordable Care Act was signed into law a year after Obama took office, and it really was in the face of nothing but crisis and adversity. But even 1 year for such a radical reform is record speed. It's a pretty fast deal to make for something that had been previously thought unthinkable. And the only thing that made that happen was the fact that it was a crisis moment, and you should never let that crisis go to waste. You use it as an opportunity for something radical and to get that passed. So once the economy and healthcare had been in the process of reform, the Obama administration then turned their eyes to the financial system itself. And in late 2010, so just short of 2 years after he took office, another legislation was signed into law. This time it was the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. The point of the reform was to make another collapse of the financial institutions and system impossible by introducing new regulations on banks and other financial systems. There's also debate as to whether or not that was well managed or not, and that once again is not my point. My point is that these are three radical, wide-sweeping policies of reform that somehow, against the odds, had been signed into law within 2 years of Barack Obama coming into office. And the reason for that is because they were hotly pursued and pushed through in light of the crisis. The whole point of that was taken advantage of by savvy political advisors and policymakers under the idea of Rahm Emanuel and like-minded White House advisors to never let a crisis go to waste. Capitalize on the crisis, get the public support and push it through before the crisis is over, and achieve the type of radical reform that could otherwise be impossible to implement if there was no crisis. So you never let that crisis go to waste. You have to work that crisis. And you have to make it work for you and the agenda that you want to bring to the forefront. So from a more historical context, Rahm Emanuel and the Obama presidential administration are just an example of this type of crisis harnessing. It's been done before. For example, during the Great Depression of the 1930s, President Roosevelt's administration launched the New Deal. And the New Deal was a series of reforms and public works programs that were designed to counter the economic collapse. And also, in another example, immediately following the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the Bush administration enacted sweeping changes to national security and counterterrorism policy. Were it not for the 9/11 attacks, Saddam Hussein, for example, in Iraq, may never have been invaded on account of those weapons of mass destruction that nobody ultimately found. But you see, what happened was that the events of 9/11 made the American people feel vulnerable. They realized their vulnerability. And of course, a nation that feels vulnerable is far more likely to follow the lead of a president and his allies, particularly when that president and allies are talking about what could potentially be even more vulnerability, like, for example, weapons of mass destruction. Because what it implies is that another attack might be likely in the future as a result of those weapons of mass destruction. And for as long as an adversarial nation has leadership that could potentially have those weapons of mass destruction, you will still continue to be vulnerable. It turned out later that there were no weapons of mass destruction that anyone could locate anyway or find evidence of, and Saddam Hussein's Iraq might or might not have been linked to terrorism, as was claimed. That wasn't proven either, but there were other strategic advantages to invading Iraq and removing its leader. It helped to reshape the Middle East. It influenced global oil trade, and you know, oil is money, isn't it? And it promoted the expansion of democratic systems inside an area that was generally resistant. Unfortunately, it didn't really serve much in the way of good in the end, because 20 years has passed, a bit more actually, and the entire US strategy was generally turned out to be a failure. Saddam Hussein was executed, but the aftermath of the US invasion brought prolonged instability and religious or fundamentalist violence to the region. And also it ultimately resulted in the emergence of a new extremist group, actually a series of extremist groups, but the most prominent of which of the time is ISIS. But you know, never mind, because if it wasn't for the 9/11 crisis, none of it would have been made possible. You know, I'm only speaking from the perspective of someone who was living in London at the time, and I was one of the people who marched with around 2 million other people in the city of London against the invasion of Iraq. So I'm kind of biased here, but and I'm going to tell you now, the official reports about that protest said that the protesters probably numbered around about 500,000 people, but take it from someone who was physically there at the time, there were many more people than 500,000 people. I'm pretty certain there were more than 1 million people in London, without a doubt. But it didn't matter how many there were, because the crisis strategy won. And that's why you should never let a crisis go to waste if you want to enact sweeping reform, regardless of what your agenda might be. Could that potentially be the reason why there's so much crisis right now? Is the crisis being implemented or enacted or activated on purpose in order to create reasons to implement radical reform. So that was all 10 or 20 years ago. But what does that have to do with anything now, right now, today? It actually might be more than what you think. Think back to another recent crisis, a really big international crisis. For example, the COVID-19 pandemic. That was a crisis, a huge one that affected the entire world. Now, I'm not a person who would think for a moment that COVID was deliberately cooked up in a lab in order to manufacture a crisis. I don't believe that even for a second. First of all, it's just common sense. It's too risky. And no human would be immune from the impact of that, including the humans that supposedly cooked it up, right? So like, for example, quite a few wealthy, influential or famous people actually died from COVID in the months during which it was at its strongest. Many wealthy people, powerful people and famous people were just as concerned about their own health as everyone else's, even if they were saying something different in front of the cameras. And there were many of those wealthy, influential, famous people who got very sick. It just so happened that they also recovered. Not because COVID was manufactured, but because they were biologically strong, with strong immune systems, or their wealth and their influence got them the best treatments, or they were just lucky. But yeah, COVID was a real crisis, a big one. And in the middle of that crisis, something interesting happened, right? Because we must never let a crisis go to waste. In June 2020, the World Economic Forum launched what it calls the Great Reset in direct response to the COVID-19 crisis. The Great Reset is marketed to be an initiative that completely reimagines the world, everything from how the world's economic systems work, its societal frameworks. And when this new initiative was launched, it did so with a really interesting video that involved the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles at the time, who, then became king. In that video, Charles talked about the world beginning on a new journey. He described it as not being the end of something, but the beginning of something new. And it was described to be an idea by the most clever of the world's clever, that came at just the right time to save us all, to save the world. Except it wasn't exactly true, because the initiative, the Great Reset idea, had been around for a very long time. It just hadn't found the right crisis yet. Right? It had been waiting. It was waiting for the perfect crisis. And then along came COVID. So long before the Great Reset became official, a man by the name of Klaus Schwab was already writing about something he called the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Going back to 2015, for example, long before COVID, Schwab wrote descriptions of a new era that will emerge, where geographic borders will disappear and the digital age will mature. And very interestingly, the line between technology and biology would begin to blur. Did you get that? Technology and biology would blur. There have been 3 other industrial revolutions in the past. There was one in the 1700s, one in the 1800s, and one in the 1900s. I'm not a historian, but they all arose from crisis. He wrote that back in 2015, but now he's the chairman of the World Economic Forum. He used to be a university professor, but I guess he got a better gig. And yes, he's the chairman of this very same World Economic Forum that has released its initiative called the Great Reset, which isn't legally binding or anything like that. It's not like a bunch of countries have signed up for it officially, but it has been endorsed by many of the world's most powerful and influential leaders, including all of the techno giants and many big businesses around the world, and economists and policy experts and academics, and of course kings as well. These powerful individuals, corporations, leaders, etc., they love the ideas coming out of the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum has 10 centers of focus, right? This is coming from its own literature. It focuses on 10 different kind of directions. And these things are really popular with a community of elite leaders that visit the Economic Forum Summit every year. These 10 areas of focus, or 10 centers of focus, well, 2 of them are focused on nature, the environment, energy management, and climate change. That's 20% of its entire focus, which is kind of weird because every year a big group of these powerful people, around about 3,000 or so of them, actually fly in their individual private jets to one of the most expensive ski resorts in the world, which is in Davos in Switzerland. They park their highly pollutive private jets in Switzerland somewhere, and they spend a little bit of time going to parties, and they have some lavish dinners. They hobnob and they network. They plan business collaborations and compare stock market wins and losses and things like that. And then once again, they get back in their polluting private jets and they fly home again. And each one has a separate jet because, they're rich. It doesn't really fit with the whole nature, environment, climate change thing, does it? No. And so you kind of have to wonder about this concentration of 2 of the 10 centers on nature and the environment. And of course, the traffic controllers over in Davos must be going bonkers when they all show up in their private jets together. But that's a whole other thing. Plus, the World Economic Forum has financing arrangements that are not really very transparent. It appears to be mostly funded by large organizations, so large corporations around the world, the really, really big ones. And it also charges membership fees to attend its summits and to participate in discussions. And it has arrangements with governments around the world, so I guess it's partly funded by taxpayers in those countries. But the first priority for large corporations is shareholder profit. And so you think to yourself, well, if the corporations are gravitating towards the World Economic Forum summits, then it's probably because it aligns somehow with the shareholder profits. Don't you think? That just makes perfect sense. And while I'm sure that the membership fees go towards really lovely dinners and hotel accommodation and parties and takeaway knickknacks for guests, it doesn't seem to really give back to the community in any particular way, apart from making Davos one of the most expensive places to live in the world. In fact, it mostly seems to be a big group of rich folk doing whatever they like while they remind us to do what we're told. For the environment, of course, you understand, to protect our planet. So 20% of the world's natural environment and climate and the way that we use energy systems that harm or don't harm the planet, that's their focus, 20%. But 40% of the World Economic Forum is focused on something far more important. And there's a clue in the title. It's focused on money. It is, after all, the World Economic Forum. Out of the 10 different centers of focus that the World Economic Forum claims to have, 4 of them are money-centric. I would say that all of them are money-centric, but officially 4 of them are money-centric. You've got the International Trade Center, you've got the New Economy and Society Center, the Manufacturing and Supply Chain Center, and the Financial and Monetary Systems Center. I don't know why they don't just merge them together and call them what they are, which is the money center, because money, So what's left? There's also a center on urban development, a center for health, which is kind of nice, thank you very much, and a center for cyber security. And then the 10th final center is that ripper of a center. That's the fourth industrial revolution center, the one that Klaus Schwab, chairman of the World Economic Forum, was writing about in 2015. And I'm sure this is an idea that he's had long before that as well. And this appears to be where the New World Order is discussed, in this sneaky little 10th center called the Fourth Industrial Revolution Center that appears on the World Economic Forum website. But of course, we don't call it the New World Order, obviously, because that would freak people out. Seriously, that is, though, what it's all about. It's about reshaping the world in the image of those who are members of the World Economic Forum, because they're the ones who are driving it forward. even though they aren't elected representatives of the people who live in the world, with the exception of a few world leaders who might give a speech here and there, or, pop over and have a dinner here and there. But the World Economic Forum is pretty much a group of unelected, rich people who are taking care of their business interests. So why would we want them to design our new world? Which includes designing the new borders of the world and the new currency and the new methods of governance and the new social policies and the methods of producing energy and food. And of course, we mustn't forget that they are also in charge of, and I quote, blurring the lines between technology and biology. And just to be really clear, these are not my words. That's their words. To blur the lines between technology and biology. Oh, and I nearly forgot. The fourth industrial revolution is also about a shift in another very interesting thing. Ownership. They want to get rid of ownership. Instead of owning something, they want us to rent it. So there's a blurring between technology and biology, and ownership is replaced with rent or service subscription. Now, I want to make it really clear about what I'm talking about here. I don't think that Klaus Schwab himself as an individual wants to take away our brain or our ownership of stuff and to leave us powerless with technology merged into our humanity and turning us into kind of like a weird machine that doesn't own anything. I don't think that's the intention behind Klaus Schwab at all. I've actually read one of his papers. It's a paper dating back to 2016 and it's called The Fourth Revolution, What It Means and How to Respond. And that paper is available on the World Economic Forum website. I think it's in the 2016 archives. It's a perfectly sensible paper. It's written by Klaus Schwab himself. And in the paper, Klaus Schwab describes a world that is merging physical, digital, and biological systems. He talks about how prioritizing this could be for humanity, but he also adds a personal note, which I think is quite reassuring, which I think is the most important part of his paper. He says that he's very concerned about what happens in the future if the fusing together of the physical, the digital, and the biological gets into the hands of self-serving, powerful people. He warns about things like identity, privacy, and human relationships. And he raises ethical concerns about data use, human augmentation, and the impact of being constantly connected to our mobile phones and other types of technology. What impact is it actually having on us? And he finishes by saying that a wonderful future is possible if individuals are empowered by these changes, but also share in the same values as each other so that it can move forward in a positive way. If people are morally conscious, then we're on the brink of something wonderful, he says, that could be extraordinary. It's a transformation that could potentially lift humanity to great heights. And yes, Klaus Schwab is the chairman of the World Economic Forum, and this paper of his dating back to 2016 is quite inspiring. And it was his idea, this fourth industrial revolution. But it seems as though his idea had an ethical basis behind it. And that's the reason why it's reassuring. But there's a problem. And the problem is that Klaus Schwab is 87 years old. He's not going to live forever. And the initiative has begun. And it's begun to transform the world into the fourth industrial revolution, where the physical and the digital and the biological all get merged together. What's going to happen to Schwab's idea after he's died, which will be soon? He is 87. Who's going to be in charge then? And why are so many corporations and influential, powerful entities flocking to this idea when primarily their interest is to create profit stream for shareholder revenue? Are they going to share his ethical perspective? So let's move a little bit forward to the current day. On the 2nd of April, 2025, a day which was branded Liberation Day, President Donald Trump unleashed one of his most aggressive trade policies in modern history. In a dramatic move that sent shockwaves through the global markets, and still is at the time that I'm speaking, Trump announced steep tariffs, some as high as 50% on imports from countries like China, Vietnam, and even the European Union. I think the latest announcement he's made is a 50% tariff on all Chinese goods, and he has even promised as much as 110% tariff as of today. And even Australia couldn't escape the tariffs, despite the fact that we currently don't have any trade issues with the US that anyone really appears to be aware of. I mean, we don't accept US beef, which is something that Donald Trump had stated he specifically was upset about. And I thought that maybe it was because the US uses growth hormones, which are like steroids, in its beef production. And maybe Australia has banned that, because I know that the European Union will not accept US beef. And I thought maybe Australia had the same rule, but I looked into it. And as it turns out, Australia uses the same growth hormones in its own beef production. So what that tells me is I'm going to have to rethink my dinner tonight. But anyway, I digress. When it comes to Donald Trump's tariffs, this seemed to begin with rhetoric, but the rhetoric was quite explosive. And then the rhetoric turned into executive orders, and stocks began to tumble. Wall Street was rocked by unprecedented corrections, and the economic fallout quickly became headline news. Markets that were until recently optimistic about a soft landing now faced a stark reversal, and people started to get a bit anxious. And, an anxious market is a turbulent market. Anyway, this tariff discussion has had a very clear and immediate impact, something kind of chaotic. And the funny thing is, something else happened during the same week that Donald Trump began to announce these tariffs. And that was that around 500,000 people went onto the streets of New York to protest against Donald Trump and Elon Musk and the threats that they've made to take away Social Security and other government efficiency actions that Elon Musk has either been threatening or his Doge team has already done, like shutting down government departments or firing public servants or stopping programs of research or education that benefit ordinary people from both sides of the political spectrum. Except it doesn't matter what else is in the news. There really isn't any new news cycle anymore, because every news cycle is basically Trump, Trump, Trump. And so although the protests were massive, and I'm sure there are more that are being planned, but this one in particular on that day was massive. And some of the protesters had particularly good signs, which are kind of entertaining, like this lady who I think has my favorite sign. It says, for those who are listening, it says, "One day the poor will have nothing to eat but the rich." I have to say that tickled me. I really like that. And you never know, it might actually happen. But anyway, the protest was probably attended by people from the right and the left, so it's really relevant to the news. And it was reported really widely for a minute. But then it disappeared, only to be replaced with ongoing debate and speculation about Donald Trump's trade tariffs, which had been announced a few days earlier and should have been old news by now. Because, things are happening every day. You'd think that it would be replaced with something else. But even today, as I'm planning the show, even today, as I'm speaking about the show, it's still number one news item. And it probably will continue to be tomorrow and next week and even next month. The trade tariffs will still be news, because even if Donald Trump isn't good at anything else, he is definitely good at staying front and center of the news every day, every hour, for nearly 10 years now. So I decided to go and take a look at the concept of the trade tariffs from an economic perspective rather than a political one, because politics is either strongly in favor or strongly opposed, and you really can't make any sense out of it. and both sides are slanting the facts to suit their agenda. I wanted to understand it from an economic perspective. So I hunted around and I found a fellow who seemed to be able to explain it in a way that I could understand, because I'm not an economist, but he also explained something else that I already knew but for some reason had forgotten. Now, when I say I'm not an economist, I mean it. I'm not even a math person. When I was in college and was doing anything math related, I spent most of my time having no idea what the professor was talking about at all. I had no clue. But I did learn something from this fellow, and he's a fellow YouTuber. His name is Andre, I think you pronounce it Zik. Andre Zik. And Andre he became kind of famous because he went from being broke to getting his first million in a year at quite a young age, based on whatever it was that he did. And I don't really worry about his method for getting rich because, he's got a YouTube channel aptly called Andre Zik, and he does little short and sweet videos talking about how to get rich, how he got rich, and about the economy and economics. It's where he talks everything money on that channel, including how he earned his first million. But I'm old enough and seasoned enough to know that he probably earned his first million the way that everyone earns their first million if they go on to become very wealthy. And it's mostly a combination of perseverance, luck, and gambling, because it always is. You can't just persevere and make money. You need to also have, because, life gets in the way. You also have to kind of take risks, which means there needs to be a gamble. And then luck has to basically shine on you for that moment that makes it all come together. And so regardless of how he describes it, it probably would have been a combination of those things, because it always is. It's never because of some particular strategy that can be shared with others, because often it won't be as easy to duplicate for someone else. But you know what? It is inspiring and good for him because he's succeeded. What I wanted to know about specifically was what the trade tariffs might actually be about, and whether Donald Trump might be doing more than just creating chaos in the news by talking trade tariffs, because the political speculation is that he's just talking and creating chaos to hide something else that is unrelated that's happening in the background. And, this concept of never letting a crisis go to waste might be playing out in a way where something secretively is happening in the background. I'm not saying it isn't, but Andre seemed to have an idea that does make some sense, which is kind of different, that other people don't seem to be talking about. So I'm going to share it with you. There are a lot of Americans who believe that bringing production and manufacturing home from overseas is the answer to any kind of economic problems. Things like securing supply chains and making and buying American goods and asserting US dominance in global trade discussions, right? That's the perspective. Donald Trump as an individual, even long before he became a politician, has been one of those people who believes in that. He believes in supply chain security, buying and making American, if it suits, and also most likely his belief is in asserting US dominance in those global trade discussions. He believes the same kind of stuff. Historically, every administration prior to the Trump administration, and including, has used trade tariffs to America's advantage. But they generally do it strategically and incrementally. And it's based on a system that's planned by a team of economic advisors over the course of time, based on forecasting and diplomatic foreign relations and relationship building exercises, and a whole lot of bureaucracy that's designed to consider the knock-on effects of other areas of government. So, one area that's affected by tariffs directly may impact or have a knock-on effect on other areas of government or the people indirectly as well. And they take all of that into account, in particular the interests of the various different segments of the US population. On the other hand, while the Trump administration claims that the new rates were reciprocal and that they mirrored what other nations were charging the US, a closer look reveals something else. The tariffs were calculated using a risky formula, most recently by Donald Trump, which appears to be, that risky formula appears to be based on trade deficits and a kind of a arbitrary factor, which is sort of niceness. If you're nice, then you're in the good books, and if you're not nice, you're not. So you're going to end up with massive trade tariffs. That method is that's being used is ignoring sections of the US population or areas of manufacturing or commerce where America is already doing really well on trade. So Donald's trade tariff method of kind of just slapping on a 50% tariff or threatening 110% tariff, things like that, might actually create a damaging effect on an area of trade that's doing really well right now. And so that gives rise to the question. Some of these areas of trade have been stable and in surplus for a long time already, and you don't really want to mess with them, which is the reason why previous administrations tend to tread delicately, and they are very specific about this, and then they leave that alone, and they use diplomacy as well, and they kind of, it's like an art form where they're doing a delicate dance to get it right. But the arbitrary trade tariffs that Donald Trump is introducing are messing with everything because they aren't strategic in terms of trade. And that's the giveaway. They're kind of just being thrown around in what looks like a bit of a random bar brawl method of negotiation. Okay. Except as Andre explains it, this might be the whole point of the method. The point of the method of this chaotic trade tariff thing may not be to just create mayhem so that something else secretive could be happening in the background, completely unrelated, that takes the news people away from, distracts them from something else. It could be the whole point is to create the chaos for the purpose of the chaos, because you should never put a crisis to waste, right? Andre seems to think that Donald Trump, and probably his economic advisors as well, are deliberately trying to destroy the US economic markets for the sake of doing that. They want to tank the stock market. They want to destroy foreign trade agreements. They want the US to go into recession. And the funny thing is, when I heard Andre say this, I suddenly remembered something I've always known, because my dad was in real estate my entire life. And I would, even as a kid, sitting at the dinner table, I'd listen to him and mum talk, even when I was really young, about really simple things like, buy low, sell high, that kind of thing. And it helped me to survive the recession that took place after the banking crisis. I was living in Britain, and it helped me just thinking in terms of things that I'd learnt in my, just being part of the family, kind of helped me to make decisions that turned out to be decent decisions during a time that was difficult following the 2008 crisis. And so I knew some of this stuff, but for some reason, I didn't realize that it was being implemented here. And Andre was really helpful in helping me to see that. And so now I kind of feel really clever because I kind of knew all along, even though I forgot that I knew. So firstly, this strategy of creating a chaotic environment around trade, it doesn't care about the impact on individuals in the short term. The way that Donald Trump might be looking at this, if Andre is the person to believe in this scenario, his theory is that eggs have to fry if necessary, right? Small businesses will have to just be destroyed. People may end up suffering and becoming homeless. All kinds of things could end up happening. The only thing that matters is the outcome. Because by the time the outcome happens, the pain felt by those who lost everything in the process will be long forgotten, because there would have been lots of news cycles and other things to worry about by then. And people do have a short memory. And they do forget things, so long as the strategy works, because it might work. That's the thing. And that's what Donald Trump and his people are counting on. They're counting on it working. At least the people will be. I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, let's keep this discussion going. So the way that it works is that when the markets are stable and the economy is stable, even if it's suffering a stagnation or an inflation or something like that, well, things start to creep up in price. They become more expensive. And it might be complicated trying to make prices lower. When we've got something like COVID that created supply chain issues that rose prices, well, the prices rose, but there was never any incentive for those prices to go down. So they never did go down. Instead, they continue to creep up because that's the path that they happen to be on. And it's very difficult to turn it around and make it go the other way without a reason. The stability is what keeps everything safe. And America has a massive debt, which makes it a humongous beast of an economy to shift in any direction. The only way to get a quick fix is to gamble. Because if the gamble pays off, then the deficit can be reduced. And that's what the aim of the game is. Like it almost never happened. Like that deficit could just be erased overnight, or a big chunk of it could be. And that has a positive impact on things like taxes and funding for government policies. But how do you suddenly and drastically reduce the deficit? Well, the way to do that is to tank the economy so that the country goes into a sharp recession. Because if the recession is deep and sharp and drastic enough, then this forces the hand of the Federal Reserve, which will have to slash interest rates. And with lower interest rates, which may be markedly lower, the US government can afford to renegotiate its debts with other countries. That's the deficit. And if the deficit is renegotiated based on the lower interest rates, then it can drop significantly. It may even cut in half overnight. In that scenario, the immediate pain that's felt by Americans can be really real. It will cripple those who have very little. It will devastate some small businesses, and it will probably make quite a few people homeless, particularly if they have been living, if they've been forced to live beyond their means, if they've got a lot of debt or something like that, or if they don't own a lot. But the gamble is that it will be short-lived. That is the gamble that the Trump administration could very well be looking at. And if the Fed reduces the interest rates significantly, then a renegotiation with other countries to renegotiate the deficit will correct the stock market. It will reinvigorate the domestic market. It will create a more balanced global trade framework. From the US perspective anyway, it doesn't really help any other country at all. In fact, most of the other countries will suffer from the negotiations and all of the other knock-on effects, but it's a massive gamble for the US as well. But someone like Donald Trump is happy to gamble. He has a lifetime of gambling. He tends to gamble on other people's money. It's something that he's accustomed to. He's not afraid of gambling. And he knows that it only has two potential possibilities. It could succeed, which means that Donald will win a lot of support, politically speaking, making him even stronger and more powerful than he already is, or it might fail. And if it fails, then it could send the entire world economy into a tailspin for years to come, perhaps even a depression, much like what was perhaps experienced in the 1930s, which, as we know, was the catalyst for the Second World War. Either way, whether this chaotic strategy wins or fails, succeeds or fails, either way it presents an opportunity. An opportunity that I've just been talking about here on the channel. It presents a crisis. Remember what I said before. Never let a crisis go to waste. So at the same time that these trade tariffs are taking place, there is a push for a new world order, for a merging together between the technology and the biology. That is the scariest thing I've ever heard. A merging, a fusion of technology and biology. And in this push for new world order, everything comes crashing down and has to be rebuilt in a new image. This might be an even bigger strategy than Andre, the economy guru, might not even have on his radar. yet. It might just be a crisis for crisis' sake, so that the world can be rebuilt into what it is expected to be by some small group of people. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see on that. But what do you think? I think it's a little bit of both, personally. I think that I can imagine that for Donald Trump himself, he's thinking, if this chaos strategy succeeds with the tariffs, then I'm going to be a hero in the world of economic revitalization, because he will be. If America begins to thrive and the economy is boosted and the deficit is reduced through this harsh trade negotiation, which I'm not even sure it's a negotiation, but this chaotic method of negotiation, then he will have become a hero in the world of economic recovery and revitalization. And if it fails, then he might be thinking that he'll get to take advantage of the crisis that comes out of it, which will allow him to build a brand new world. But what do I know? I'm just a tarot card reader from Australia who barely passed math at school. I did pass though. Just. So amid all of these economic, technological and geopolitical shifts that are currently taking place all around us, some of them being initiated by things like the Great Reset, some by the techno-oligarchs, some by government, and of course those hidden forces and agendas that want to create a new world order that we may not be able to identify or specifically acknowledge. Well, there's an even deeper and more ancient battle, and that's the fight for our humanity and our divinity. As the rise of advanced artificial intelligence and the merging of technology with human biology, which I still find really scary, is accelerating right before our eyes, we are confronted with what I think is quite a vital question. What does it truly mean to be human? What does that mean? Every day, our thoughts and our beliefs and our very identities face systematic challenges. If you listen to the mainstream voices out there, you might feel as though us ordinary people, the ones who make up this ordinary collective humanity, were randomly created by a process of mutation or something that is called evolution. But, really? Were we? I know that I don't feel like a mutation, and many of us don't feel like a mutation. We feel a kind of a spark inside us that it means something more than this mainstream idea. It's a little spark of something that transcends our biology. And we may not know how to harness it, and some people may not know how to even recognize it inside them, but we all feel it in some way, and it's often described to be that light inside us, which also is our described by some to be our closeness to the divine realm, so our divinity, our human divinity. It is the one thing that makes us, creative, artistic, musical, or talented with the spoken word or with the written word. That special spark that we have. I know that this probably is something that many people have experienced, but I know, I've watched or listened to famous people, artists or poets or musicians or writers describing how the creative process that they engage in, that they're so renowned for, it feels like a flowing process of inspiration that comes from something greater than themselves. I've heard many people say that, and perhaps you have too, and I've felt it myself. I even feel this way sometimes when I'm writing, but I certainly feel it when I'm reading the tarot cards. Some people refer to it as being in the zone, or they get that sense when they're meditating or something. And I feel it also when I'm tending to my garden, to my veggie patch, for example. When I see it growing and I'm doing things good for it and I'm kind of out there and just switched off to everything else. And I also feel it when I'm listening to my favorite music sometimes. But I've even felt it at times when I'm listening to an audio book, for example, and I'm getting really deeply involved with the characters. or with the messaging, and I get lost in what the author or the narrator is saying, it feels as though I've tapped into something greater than myself. And this can't be just this mutation speaking. I think it relates to this spark. I get to the point where I can almost feel what the writer must have been feeling as they were typing their words into the computer, creating this book that then became an audiobook. These are all hints, I think, of our connection to the ancient world and the ancient force that empowers us to overcome our perceived limitations in life. It's a really important part of being human. You know, life's challenges can sometimes feel as though we're being presented with relentless opposition, that it never ends. There's always something, like we're being deliberately held back by something else outside of our control. But our best version of ourselves is about forgetting about that sense of opposition or defeated attitude in the moment and focusing on our inherent power that comes from that inner spark, the inner force within us that is divine in nature, that comes from the same place that our sense of artistry and creativity comes from. Crisis is something that will always be happening around us. It can't be avoided because most crises are out of our control. They tend to be created and perpetuated by outside forces or outside people. And most of the time they aren't coming from us. I mean, sometimes they are, but mostly they're not. But as humans, you know, we do have the ability to empower ourselves and to transcend the things that constrain us. We can transcend gender restrictions, cultural barriers, and societal constraints because we're human. But as technology advances, there is a growing desire to merge us, to fuse us together with that technology, and to replace our organic bodies with synthetic alternatives. Now, it's perfectly fine. It's actually amazing, I think, to enjoy the privilege of a new knee or, you know, a new knee joint or a transplanted heart if you need one. That sounds great, because these are things that are gifts from the universe, and our evolution as a species into a technologically advanced species that has allowed us to use technology to improve our lives while we are alive. But placing chips in our brain or some kind of a sensor under the skin that can be used as a barcode or something, that is not the same thing. That's designed to measure and weigh us and limit our divine presence, that thing that makes us human. These things might seem attractive to some rich guy who never wants to die and therefore, you know, wants to, I don't know, replace his brain or whatever it is. But for an ordinary person, it takes away the one thing that makes us quintessentially human. If we allow technology to redefine what it means to be human, we may also be agreeing to forfeit our ability to access that sacredness inside us, that divine power that makes us uniquely capable of things like love and innovation and transcendence. The battle for our humanity and divinity is not just me trying to be more of a philosopher than I really am. It really is a battle that's taking place right now. Whether we're deliberating over global trade policy or navigating the challenges presented by the World Economic Forum, Industrial Revolution, the fourth Industrial Revolution, or resisting divisive social narratives that come from both sides of the spectrum. The core question remains and will always be the same. Will we allow the modern world, which is largely pinned to become the technological world, forming part of a new world order born from opportunity, the opportunity to never let a crisis go to waste? Will we allow the world to diminish our divineness, our divine light? Or will we rise and fully embody the endless potential that defines our human spirit? Technology is wonderful. Use it to cure diseases, use it to help people to live the best life that they can be. But when it comes time to fuse it with our consciousness, say no. I'm on the side of the divine spirit that humanity has inside it. What side are you on? This is Ellie, and you can find me at Ellie Dreams and Under on YouTube. Thank you to everyone who has been listening or watching today on one of KGRA's broadcasting platforms. If you would like to be a member of the KGRA viewership family, I'm being bugged by the dog. If you'd like to be a member of the KGRA viewership family and hang out with other like-minded watchers, experiences and spiritualists, and of course, you know, the occasional weirdo like me, then just go to live.kgradb.com and enter promo code Ellie to get 30% off your subscription. I think it's time for me and the puppy because the canine spark is pretty cool too, isn't it? Yeah, we like dogs. That's it for today. It's been a pleasure. Until next time.